Welcome to this Asia Global podcast, brought to you by the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. I'm your host, Alejandro Reyes, the Institute's Director of Knowledge Dissemination. In our programs here in Hong Kong and online, and in the content that we produce, we focus on presenting Asian perspectives on global issues. This podcast is part of our Meet the Authors series, where we have a conversation with contributors to Asia Global Online and other publications of the Institute. Our topic in this podcast is the impact of the pandemic on the most vulnerable, specifically Bangladesh's garment workers. Joining me now from the Bay Area, San Francisco, are Nancy Reyes Mullins. She is an independent researcher who graduated in 2020 from the Master of Development Practice program at the University of California, Berkeley. Also joining us from San Francisco is Sanchita Banerjee Saxena. She is director of the Subir and Malini Chowdhury Center for Bangladesh Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. And from New York, someone I've known for a while who I know, like the city, never sleeps, Salil Tripathi. He is Senior Advisor, Global Issues at the UK-based Institute for Human Rights and Business. So Nancy, Sanchita, Salil, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Now, in your article on Asia Global Online, you write that power imbalances are at the heart of the devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on Bangladesh's crucial ready-made garment industry. Intense competition between suppliers and a lack of transparency enables the brands to dictate the terms of their agreements. This in turn leaves workers at the mercy of employers who imposed layoffs for an estimated 10% of the workforce, furloughs for most during lockdown, and a heightened level of uncertainty for everyone, especially the most vulnerable, such as women, and women make up the majority of the workers in this sector. Now, you are authors of a study on the impact of the pandemic on Bangladesh's garment workers, which is conducted by the Institute for Human Rights and Business in partnership with the Subir and Malini Chowdhury Center for Bangladesh Studies at Berkeley. Your study was also conducted with the support of the United Nations Development Program, Business and Human Rights in Asia, the UNDP Bangladesh Country Office, and the Swedish International Development Cooperation Agency. And you collected information on the responses of global retailers to the COVID-19 pandemic and its effects on Bangladesh garment workers. And the report, which is available online, and I commend the report to our listeners. The link is on Asia Global Online in your article. The report is The Weakest Link in the Global Supply Chain, How the Pandemic is Affecting Bangladesh's Garment Workers, which was published in May 2021. Now, you conducted a lot of qualitative research, primarily by interviewing the brands and Bangladeshi manufacturers and union leaders. And you found that the lockdown had several adverse impacts on workers. A large majority, as I said, are women, affecting their standard of living, the quality of food they consumed, and their physical and mental health, and resulting in a fall in wages of nearly a third by some estimates. So this impact is really a result, as you point out, because of the way the global ready-made garment industry is structured. Now, Nancy, if I could just start with you, I'm wondering if you'd talk a bit about that why this particular impact was resulted because of the way the RMG industry is structured.
Yeah, sure. I'd be happy to. And Alejandro, can I call you Al?
Yeah, please do. Call me Al. As the song goes, you can call me Al, right?
Well, the Bangladeshi workers are not unique in the situation that there are apparel workers across many other countries in Asia that were similarly affected. It's really the case that about 80% of Bangladesh's exports are tied to the ready-made garment industry. So we felt that this would be a perfect study to identify what was going on immediately, really kind of during COVID. The interviews occurred primarily in October, November, and December of 2020, and kind of seeing how the brands were responding. And within the funnel, that kind of identifies like an upside down triangle, how at the very top are the brands, which are smaller in number. And so they have, in a sense, almost very dominant control over who they select as their suppliers, what countries, which suppliers, what allocations they make to those different suppliers. And so they put out contracts and the suppliers compete. And so the suppliers, in a sense, are in the middle of that funnel, competing for business, and they're not likely to cooperate and collaborate in a way that gives them the leverage to be able to command control over pricing. So they very much respond to what prices the brands are demanding. And then the workers, which fall at the bottom of that funnel, have very little voice, particularly in Bangladesh, where it can be hard to form labor unions. And they kind of lack the empowerment to be able to advocate for themselves. There's great situations where we'll talk about where they were able to do that in this situation, but more broadly, the workers are just completely dependent on the suppliers, and then the suppliers dependent upon the brands. So the workers really fall at the bottom.
Right. And the devastation was quite severe in terms of canceled orders and cut orders, right? I mean, and probably continues to be quite devastating. Or?
Yes, I want to say towards the end of April, once the lockdowns kind of across the world had gone into effect at the kind of earlier stages of the COVID pandemic, around 3.4 billion in orders had been canceled. So a tremendous amount of orders. And then many times the suppliers have taken on the responsibility of sourcing all the materials, kind of producing the clothes, and they don't get compensated until that clothes is received. So what we saw happen was that a lot of orders were being canceled, suppliers were therefore not being paid, and workers subsequently weren't being paid. And towards September, October, as we were conducting the interviews, there were changes that were occurring, both pressure from consumers and civil society organizations that encouraged brands to then kind of recommit and fulfill some of those orders that were either put on hold or canceled. So the situation did subsequently improve, and Sanchita's got some really great insight on kind of how those civil societies were able to kind of leverage the information that came from the labor organizations and advocate for the workers. So things looked pretty bad in April and May and subsequently got better, but there was still a lot of room for improvement.
Right. Now, Salil, I'm wondering if you talk about, I mean, your institute works very much with businesses to try to talk about a lot of these issues, best practices and standards, treatment of workers. What was your general impression in doing the study of the good, the bad, and the ugly among the brands? Because it's not all a bad news story in the sense that there were some brands that did right. So I'm wondering if you talk a bit about that.
Sure. So what happens in a typical situation like this is that there is very little in the incentive structure of the industry to promote good behavior. The market forces are such, the pressure to reduce prices, the pressure to reduce costs is such, and largely because consumers want the clothes at a cheap rate, that there is enormous pressure on the buyers within the brands to drive the best bargain that they can. So they want to offer the least that they can for the quality that they're after without compromising on any of the standards. And the parameters which determine the pricing is completely determined by economics and the cost of production, cost of distribution, and the price that the market can bear. So all the imponderables that you're talking about, the social aspects, the human rights aspect, the labor rights aspect. And if you really look hard at it, the cost is not that much incrementally. You're talking about a very small proportion of the total cost. But because it's so competitive, it becomes that they just want to say no to anything that is going to raise costs. So I think what happened with a lot of companies as soon as the crisis occurred was that they realized that they are not going to be able to move the goods very quickly. The goods are not going to come into the global supply chain quickly enough. And even if they did, then they're going to have a surfeit of stockpiles, because you're going to find that the malls are closed. People are not buying clothes. They're not going to the mall. The footfall is going to be less, and people are not going to hold on to their wallets because a lot of the buyers are worried about losing their jobs. So I'm just trying to explain in a long-winded way about what a company was thinking about its own survival. Now, some of it was an existential fear, but some of it was also a surreal fear. It was not going to happen that way, because these are very strong companies with fairly large cash balances and sufficient power and the ability to raise loans where they wanted. And as they found later, as time progressed, that they were able to actually manage the crisis quite well. And once they realized that it was no longer existential, they were able to take the kind of steps that were necessary to reassure the suppliers and act right. But the clause that they wanted to turn to immediately was what in law is called force majeure. Essentially, they wanted to use the clause that this is an act of God. And in a way it is. I mean, whether or not you're a believer, the fact is that when something like a pandemic happened, nobody has planned it. Nobody has devised it, and nobody has designed it. It has just happened, like an earthquake or, a cyclone or a tsunami, for that matter. So in that kind of a context, companies felt that, they could move away, and they started moving away. But because the liquidity levels are very low, so the suppliers, the Bangladeshi manufacturers, suddenly found that they simply did not have the resources to bear that burden. So where do you, and so that goes back to the whole weakest link argument, that when the buyer refuses to buy, the supplier has his or her own cash flow to manage, the person who ultimately ends up bearing the burden is a woman who's working in the garment sector. And at the same time, some companies did actually announce at the outset that we will honor all the contracts for which we are paid for, because a lot of the suppliers have already paid for the raw material, the cotton, the dyes, the colors, and the threads that are going to come in. So whatever was already contracted for some companies, and I would say maybe, from those that we surveyed, probably about a fifth of them agreed to do that. Then there were some who suspended without canceling anything because they wanted to know more before they were to take the next step. And they were susceptible to pressures from consumers and activists, which Sanchita will tell more about as we go on. And then there were some which were adamant, and they actually invoked that clause. They said, sorry, we're not going to pay up.
Right.
But as Nancy was just pointing out, as time moved forward, when the companies realized that the situation is not as dire, that people are going back to the markets, people are buying, and there's a lot of e-commerce going on, it became possible for the liquidity cycle to get started again.
I know there's a lot of e-commerce going on, because certainly I was one of those people just sort of impulse buying all the time, because when you're at home, but it's interesting. So I'm wondering if you could drill down, because you of course talked about the impact on women, but then in large part there are many issues that then get mixed in, because of course it affects families, it affects children, it affects education, and then also laying off or furloughing people. It means they need to find shelter, they need to go home, and of course because of the pandemic, issues such as social distancing and where they live may not actually be conducive to protecting them. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that, bring it to us kind of on the really at the ground level, and the full impact.
No, it's a great question. And I think the Chowdhury Center actually did a separate study, which Sanchita can tell more about interviewing actually more than 1,000 workers with the BRAC University in Bangladesh. And I will give a very top line conclusions from that, and Sanchita can elaborate more. But they did find that, women were forced to return home and stay at home. And when they did stay at home, there are inevitable problems of, actually being confined to a tiny space because none of the homes are very large. The other problem, of course, being that you may have an abusive relationship, in which case there's a risk of violence at home from the partner. Children are also at home because schools are not working, and they're completely and they're furloughed and they're not getting any income level, and that's the third part of it. And one of the most heartrending stories that I read from those interview surveys that came out was that people stopped eating meat. Protein intake started going down. Nutrition levels suffered hugely. And, as it is, Bangladeshi diet is fish and rice primarily. So all the more nutritious, more protein generating food items just disappeared from people's menus. And that, I think, had a huge impact. And I think that's the kind of study we need to know as a follow-up, what are the impacts on people's calorie intake levels and what that has meant to people. And we don't yet know. So, it's like, before, many of us know that there was this enormous tragedy in Bangladesh a few years ago when Rana Plaza, this building collapsed and, more than 1,100 workers died. And at that time, the average wage was almost just above the World Bank definition of $1.28 a day, the absolute poverty level. And it was gradually increased to something closer to $68 a month, which is roughly 2-point-something dollars a day. So you're, just skating on very thin ice. You don't have ice skating rinks in Bangladesh. It's a tropical country, but you can see what I'm trying to get at. Like you're just about able to make ends meet. But in that kind of a context, when even there's a slight disequilibrium, you're going to fall down. And as we know from studies in development economics, then to climb back is much harder because by then a new cohort has come into the marketplace to get jobs. So the intensity of pressure just magnifies.
And so the impact will be with us for some years, I would imagine.
I would think so, yes. And it's not unique to Bangladesh.
Right.
I think it could apply to other countries too, but certainly to Bangladesh, yes.
Right. Thank you. So, Sanchita, you've already been prompted essentially by your colleagues. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that study that you did, first of all, in getting to understand really the stresses and the pressures, challenges that our workers face.
Yeah, absolutely. So this was a study we did because of COVID. It was all done, I managed it remotely and it was all done by mobile phones due to the COVID restrictions that were in place, which that was an interesting sort of challenge for research. We've sort of experienced how to actually conduct research during a pandemic. But as Salil mentioned, we interviewed over 1,000 workers in Bangladesh. It was June and July of 2020. And the results, we got a lot of very interesting and quite sort of heartbreaking, actually, data, and which is detailed in the report. But a couple of things, and Salil highlighted those, a couple of things I do want to also mention. With respect to COVID, what was interesting was when we spoke to many of the brands who we interviewed, they highlighted all the different precautions they took. And we don't doubt that they took those precautions and they sort of told their suppliers to, make sure workers were distanced and make sure there were hand sanitizers and make sure that there were, shifts were staggered so not everyone was in the factory. But when we did the surveys and we actually asked questions to workers about what was their experience. They said, oh yeah, a week or so, those were in place. And then after that, nothing. It was business as usual. And we asked questions to actually measure sort of fear and anxiety and worry, kind of getting into sort of some of the mental health aspects of the impacts of COVID. And actually that came out a lot that, and not surprisingly, women in particular were extremely concerned. Even though these protocols were in place, they were actually very concerned about the practicality. I mean, how do you distance in a country like Bangladesh, in factories with so many thousands of workers? Right. And then the other aspect of that was, as Salil mentioned, if they have to go home, but then what happens? I mean, where are they going to isolate? There is not really good, there's really no sort of health insurance or guaranteed sort of severance if you lose your job, or, all those sort of social protections are really lacking in Bangladesh. And that really came to head during the pandemic. So that it was all compiled together with the fear of, one, contracting COVID, and two, what happens if I lose my job? I mean, I basically can't feed my family. And there was a lot of, I mean, not just our study, it was certainly a lot of even journalistic accounts of workers really, really suffering during the pandemic, and just basically, they couldn't feed their family.
Right.
As Salil mentioned, I mean, the wages in during quote unquote good times are actually extremely low. I mean, it's nothing close to a living wage. And so during the pandemic, when they actually didn't get paid for several weeks, that really impacted workers even more. So, we collected a lot of that data. Basically, workers said they couldn't really save. The nutritional sort of indices that we measured, various sort of measures of hardship that were, quite heartbreaking and unfortunately not shocking, given we know sort of the history of the way workers are treated in Bangladesh.
Right. Now and Nancy referred to the activities of civil society groups and work that they've done. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about that in terms of trying to defend workers' rights, as well as ensure that they have proper conditions and that their health and safety were looked after.
Yeah, so what was a kind of a amazing story, I think, that we highlight in the report that came out of this pandemic was really this transnational organizing that took place. And it was very interesting because we interviewed 4 different organizations that were involved with campaigns, and it varies in various ways, and this is detailed in the report. But what was really interesting was how, I mean, I think there were a few aspects. One was that this sort of coalition was built between workers and factory owners, which oftentimes they're butting heads. They're on opposite sides, because workers will tell you in Bangladesh, but in all, throughout the world, owners sort of take advantage of them, just as brands take advantage of the suppliers. The suppliers, the owners of these factories, really take advantage of workers, and that's usually, it's very conflictual. In this case, because of the order cancellations, they almost came together for a short time to be on the same side. And that was to basically demand from the brands and the retailers that you need to pay up. And so there was this whole entire campaign, the pay up campaign that really Remake, they spearheaded with Clean Clothes campaign. And we had other groups that were involved. And I think the other, few things that came out of our interviews that why it was so successful. The other thing was that the demand was very clear. So before, I mean, generally when we think about transnational organizing, we think about it's in more general terms. We need to uplift workers. We need to improve workers' rights. These are the goals, but in some ways that can be a little vague. Here it was very clear. You need to pay up for the work that's already been done. The what you have not paid, you owe them. You owe this amount of money, and it was $20 billion that they were able to recover through this campaign. The other thing was, I mean, there was a series of kind of things that happened, as you mentioned. Everyone was suddenly online, so having this campaign online and sort of the highlighting, the naming, the shaming the brands, and creating this sort of almost like tarnishing the brand image online was really impactful. I think brands did not want to be, when everyone's attention was focused, they did not want to be on the sort of the receiving end or the bad, on the bad list. They were really eager to actually get off that bad list. And then I think the other thing was, which was amazing to me, so I've done a lot of work on Rana Plaza and post Rana Plaza, and the last time I remember the Bangladeshi garment industry so prominent in everything from the New York Times, Wall Street Journal to Vogue, it was in every sort of, publication and more popular media. This wasn't policy wonk sort of analyzing it, or academics writing journal articles. I mean, this was in the popular media, and they really brought up this, this pay up campaign and what was happening. And so that, the sort of average consumer really got a sense of what was happening and how this was playing out and how workers were being affected. And that was also, I think, unique during this time.
Interesting. Now, Nancy, if I could come back to you and talk a bit about, I think you, in the report, it's interesting because as I mentioned with Salil, there were some good examples of responsible business practices exhibited by brands during the pandemic, and they come out in the report. So, I mean, in some ways, there isn't just the kind of bad list or naughty list, but there's also a list of people, of brands that did right. And then I think one of the more useful, or the most useful thing is that your report does have recommendations in terms of, you urge brands and companies to do certain things. So I'm wondering if you could talk about that sort of positive side. In other words, what needs to be done in order to adopt these best practices? What are the sort of guidelines that you guys outline in your report?
Yeah. Well, what I'll briefly mention, as Sanchita was talking, is that there were companies that proactively took responsibility. So I was thinking of H&M, and one of the things with the apparel industry is that if no one's doing anything, like inaction can like sustain for a long time, but once a brand does something good and kind of stands out as a leader, then other brands then kind of have a domino effect, and they also don't want to be left out. Reputation is so important in this industry. So H&M came out very early on and committed to honoring all of their contracts. And they then got used by the worker rights consortium as an example of like how businesses should be owning up to their responsibilities. And so I think, yeah, that's
very powerful. I think if there is an example like that, I think.
Yeah. So they really did a lot to,
Right.
yeah, kind of show the way that business could be managed responsibly.
Right.
I mean, we really feel that like the partnerships, for example, during the Rana Plaza and after the Rana Plaza collapse, there were kind of two different alliances that were brought together. And we think that kind of partnership, both many of the executives that we interviewed that oversee supply chain and sustainability kind of pointed out that partnering with peers, because one of the things that happens is a brand will source from multiple suppliers, and they may only be 10%, 15% of one supplier's kind of total production. And so they both don't feel like that the workers are their employee, the workers aren't their employees, and they also aren't the only ones contracting. So they don't have like full responsibility over one supplier. That isn't that a direct relationship. So we think that like coalitions and partnerships where the brands can kind of come together, share best practices, and kind of agree on almost kind of rules of engagement and how they're going to interact with their suppliers so that it's less competitive and more collaborative. I think that's a really good example of one. There was also the conversation around a fund, creating some kind of fund that can be like an emergency response fund, because while this situation, we hope there won't be another experience quite like a global pandemic, but there will likely be another shock to the system in Bangladesh, whether that's a natural disaster or kind of civil unrest or whatever situation that may be. Having the brands prepared to collaboratively again provide some kind of assistance to the workers would really be helpful.
Right. Thank
And
you.
Al, if I can just
Yes,
add,
for sure. Yeah.
I just following up what Nancy just said, what was interesting is a brand mentioned specifically Rana Plaza. So as Rana Plaza kind of resulted in improved factory safety. So, similarly, the feeling is amongst some brands, COVID will result in at least a conversation about social protections. I thought that was an interesting sort of comparison of what a disaster or crisis could lead to. And in this case, the social protection aspect of, it's really the responsibility of governments ultimately, but can brands play a role? Can they, help provide a fund? Can they pressure governments to, create a system of social protections? And I think with COVID, it was just very shockingly, I think we were all so aware that the lack of social protections and what that means for workers. So I thought that was an interesting sort of analogy between Rana Plaza.
Right. Now, Salil, when you think about businesses, particularly in a sector as competitive as the ready-made garment industry, one thinks about the profit motive and kind of a race to the bottom in terms of trying to get the most profit out of a very low margin business. How do you work with businesses to make, at least when it comes, certainly when it comes to workers' conditions, is to make it a race to the top? And we've talked about, well, having a role model or a company that is publicly lauded or identified as having best practices. But how can we work with, or how can you and others and governments work with these companies, not only the brands, but certainly the suppliers too, to see them race to the top in terms of labor standards?
So the race to the top is a consequence of several incentives that can be built into the system. First of all, it needs to be required by the state. What Sanchita was talking about, the need for social protection of some kind through better minimum wage policies and adherence to it, and enforcement of that is important. And these are all we have to recognize. These are Bangladeshi workers in Bangladesh. So the buck stops or starts, whatever you want to call it, has to start with Bangladesh. There is a role, of course, for the industry to play from outside, and the pressure that they are susceptible are largely too, because there's relatively little that can be done by government except through moral suasion, their own governments. If you're a British company or an American company, in theory you can say that your export finance can be made predicated. If you need export finance at all, or any kind of support from the state, could be made contingent on your following certain policies. But it becomes very, it's normative. It can't be. It's very hard to implement it. The pressures that they are susceptible are from investors on one hand, and the other is consumers. So I think there's a great need for consumers themselves to start demanding that I don't mind. I do want a $10 T-shirt, but how is it made? And it's some kind of a relationship that can be built. And you started seeing it in terms of agricultural commodities. Now the eggs you buy very often comes with a photograph of the farmer from whose farm the supermarket has bought it. Coffee is similar then, and chocolates I've seen that, that this came from this particular farm in Philippines, for example. So I'm not necessarily saying that each T-shirt should have the name of the person who made it, because the work is broken up into so many tasks that it may not be that simple. But I think some way that there is a relationship built between the person who makes the cloth, makes the clothing, and the person who uses it. And that can only come to the power of marketing and through consumer pressure that can happen. Because, one of the things, it's a very competitive industry, but it's also very susceptible to consumer pressure. It's very easy for a good campaign, as ACT UP showed, to shame a company. If you say that, this company is not doing it right, that it has sweatshop labor and the labor supply, and then the company is forced to make those changes. It's very easy to hide if you're not on the high street and main street. So those incentive structures can play a role. And the other is the role of, if these are listed companies, this can only happen if the companies are listed, but if they're listed on the stock market, then there can be some requirements that can be built in by the stock market authorities in terms of disclosure. That just as modern slavery, the legislation that has come about in many parts of the world, where companies are now supposed to reassure the investor and the stock market that we have undertaken due diligence to ensure to the extent possible that there's no modern form of slavery in a supply chain. And I think
Right.
if some kind of pressure of that can be built in, that is another way that can. So you already have laws in place, they need to be strengthened, and you need all these other market-based pressures that can be brought in that can work. Because I mean, we do live in a system which is extremely dispersed, and in that kind of a supply chain, the globalization moves at a much rapid, and you know, the more pressures you apply on an industry like Bangladesh, this is a very footloose industry. It will just move to another country where the pressure is much less, where the consumer pressure is less likely to be the case. And you don't want that to happen. I mean, one of the most interesting thing you find from trade unions in Bangladesh, and we spoke to a couple of the leaders there, is that nobody says boycott our goods. Nobody says that punish because they know that livelihood of, you know, millions of workers is dependent on that.
Interesting. So you mentioned modern slavery. I'm just wondering briefly whether the situation in the pandemic has in fact shifted workers who had been in the formal sectors into informal sectors where they might be more susceptible or might have fallen into slavery. Is that, can you talk a bit about that?
Certainly, I would think that certainly they moved from less hazardous to more hazardous sectors of industry. I mean, this is a common problem, you know, when there are so many campaigns that are run to eliminate child labor, let's say in South Asia, and you often find that the children who are taken away from working in garment factories end up making bricks. Or in the cases of both, I mean, all three countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, you might end up finding them working in ship breaking industries, you know, in Alang in India or Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where they are in much more hazardous conditions. And I'm not even going into even more heinous types of abuses, such as child sexual slavery and, you know, trafficking and all that. So, I mean, yes, some of these good intentions of eliminating forms of labor can actually lead to far more adverse consequences. So, pandemic certainly does that, in the sense that it exposes people to slavery-like conditions or certainly more hazardous conditions.
Right. Now, Sanchita, I wonder if you talk a bit, Salil mentioned, you know, government, and you talked about the need for social safety nets. Well, how has the Bangladesh government been reacting, in terms of, you know, confronted with all the issues that we've talked about? What have been the policies? What have been the reactions to some of these challenges that have come up?
Well, I think the government, you know, certainly came out, you know, they said that our industry is really going to be, you know, devastated if the brands don't pay up, you know. So there was the government with the private sector sort of coalition, which is very strong in Bangladesh, even, you know, prior to COVID. So together they did come out and sort of say that this is really detrimental to our industry. The government did provide some sort of how do you term it? Not a safety net, but like a really sort of compensation, I think, for like a fund for the various factories. What we did find, we talked to some of the suppliers who were able to avail of this money, sort of I guess a rescue package, you could call it that. But it was really limited, I think, to the larger factories and definitely the registered factories. I mean, the larger factories did have more access. They anyway have more access to capital and other resources anyway. So I think a lot of the medium and smaller factories certainly were really devastated during COVID. I mean, they didn't have any means to get any support. The government was also very much, you know, there's a lot of criticism actually in terms of its approach to dealing with COVID in terms of lockdowns. You know, there was official lockdowns, and then, but then the private sector kind of lobbied, and so then they opened up they allowed the garment factories to open up, but at the same time, all the transportation modes were stopped, and so workers were walking literally miles and miles to get to their factory, their place of work. I mean, it was not really thought through very well. So like I said, I mean, I think it's a mixed response. I think definitely some groups would say it was just a very, hodgepodge kind of response in the first lockdown. This most recent lockdown a few months ago, I mean, the latest I saw, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if the others have read on this recently, and you have any, sort of new information. I got the sense that they were a little bit more aware, and they were trying to plan it a little bit better. I think the first time was just really difficult on workers. But at the same time, I think workers felt really frustrated. The biggest thing, and what we talked about, is I think ultimately it's the really lack of social security nets for workers, and the majority of people, in terms of healthcare, in terms of severance pay, in terms of unemployment, and all those things really are almost non-existent. I think there was a UN study where it said that Bangladesh, and they categorize it in like 8 different categories where countries are supposed to meet the requirements, and I think Bangladesh is like a 1 out of 8 in terms of what they meet. So it's really, really minimal, the kinds of social protections that the government provides. So again, that's, I think, one of the big pushes for countries like Bangladesh, post-COVID. It's a real lesson.
Thank you. So Sanchita, I wonder if I could move on from that particular, with that point about Bangladesh, because Bangladesh is really an interesting development story these days, because we've seen the country graduate from least development country status to middle income. And what you're talking about indeed are challenges that once you get to that point, you really have to start thinking, I mean, if not before, how to address some of these issues, like the need for social safety nets. Can you talk a bit about, Bangladesh as a development story that really is good news for the development world, even with challenges such as the pandemic, which have now kind of disrupted that trajectory?
Yeah, I mean, Bangladesh is a paradox, and it always has been, and it continues to be in so many ways. So on one hand, I mean, it is an amazing story, as its 50 years of independence, to have it be in the middle income status, given where it started, given all the issues that it has faced over the last 50 years, a whole host of issues, from natural disasters to endemic poverty, to actually wide variations in governance. And it's kind of ironic, actually. It's almost a paradox even in the social sciences, because the lack of governance, despite that, in some ways, it still has continued to grow, and grow enough where it is, now in middle income status. I think we have to remember the growth is a large part due to the garment industry, of course, but also to migrant labor. Bangladeshis are in the Middle East, in the Gulf countries. They're in Italy, they're in Greece, Bangladeshi migrants, and they send their remittances back home, and that is really fueled the economy. But like with any success story, I mean, there's also sort of the hidden, the incredible inequality actually in the country, which is actually growing. So on a macro level, we've seen, GDP growth, and we've seen, exports growing. But at the same time, the average worker, the average migrant, there are very few protections for them. So it kind of, I've seen a lot of things written, about the 50 years, and some, have started to question, I mean, who is this growth for? Who benefits? There's definitely the elite, in many of them garment factory owners, in fact, who are the elite in society, who certainly benefit from this growth. But I would still say the bulk of the population, the majority, are whether they're employed in the garment sector, whether they're employed abroad, and which COVID has just really disrupted that as well. Minimal protections. And so really the growth has been on the backs of these workers, migrant workers, factory workers. And I think it's important to remember that.
What about issues such as quality of governance? Of course, many people will bring up the issues of, behavior of companies, but not only that, but behavior of government officials, administrative efficiencies, and all of those sorts of issues. Have improvements in those areas been a significant part of the Bangladesh development story? The good news that we've seen?
Well, I don't know. Maybe Salil, you might have a slightly.
I was going to go there.
I'm not. Well, I guess I can say this on this podcast. I'm certainly not a fan of the current government, and I would say again, despite the way this government has governed, despite that, I think the country in the macroeconomic sense and those indicators has done well. I mean, there's there's just historically been issues of really poor governance, a lot of corruption, and increasingly what is very worrying is a lot of repression. I mean, just repression for all types of freedoms. It is moved from sort of a quasi-democratic nation to pretty much a semi-authoritarian regime. And so, I mean, it is actually, for those of us who are following what's happening there, it's quite worrying in terms of the way the path this government is taking. And yeah, so I would say, I mean, the other sort of piece of this in Bangladesh's story, which we also have to mention, I mean, Bangladesh has probably the largest NGO sector and civil society in the world. So, I mean, I tend to think a lot of the development success has to do with some of the major development organizations. You know, again, I would say despite a lot of the inadequacies of the government and the governance, you know, you have BRAC, you have the Grameen Bank, you have, you know, sort of thought leaders from Sarfazle Abed to, you know, Muhammad Yunus. Yes. I mean, they making significant change. And in fact, Bangladesh has become sort of uniquely positioned as providing sort of South-South development alternatives, which is quite unique. You know, the Bangladesh is sort of transporting its development, you know, practices and plans to other countries in the global South, in other parts of South Asia, Middle East, and Africa. So I think that itself is also a very interesting story.
Salil, do you have something to?
No, I agree with
this
a
issue.
lot. I mean, I was going to say something that I've said elsewhere, that, you know, its success is not because of the government, but in spite of the government. And I think Sanchita hints as much. And I think I can only stress again what BRAC has done, because BRAC is literally like the Oxfam of the global South. You know, you see BRAC doing work in Ethiopia, you see BRAC's work in Tanzania, I've seen them in East Africa, not Tanzania, but East Africa, I've certainly seen them. They were in Afghanistan at one point, you know, of course now, I mean, almost every aid agency is trying to get its people out of the country. So I think obviously there is something to be learned there. And in addition to, you know, BRAC and Grameen as two classic examples, there's of course the Ganushastra Summit. You know, they are the people who have done extremely good work with primary healthcare. Zafarullah and what they have done. So I think, and the women's organization, you know, I know Sholish Kendra for Justice and Empowerment, and there's another NGO called Nari Pokho, which works with women's rights. So Bangladesh is an extremely strong body of people who are used to, because the political setup has been so chaotic over the last many, you know, there have been so many coups in the 80s and 90s. And after that, there have been unstable regimes, and there was a time when there was a caretaker government and all that. And that, I'm not saying that therefore people have lost faith in the government, but people know that they have to look after themselves. And if you look at it again, while the garment sector is, you know, a great example of a success story because of private enterprise, but when you talk about the remittances, these are individuals who choose to go out and leave. And you know, somebody who takes a loan to buy 2 cows and produce milk and sell it in the market, the woman who does that with a Grameen loan, she also is doing it basically on the strength of her own initiative. So this ability to move and work without an overpowering government is quite an interesting example. How replicable it is a different question. I mean, you know, to what extent it's cultural, to what extent it's political, it's something, you know, I mean, beyond my pay grade or whatever, or beyond my knowledge base, let me put it that way. I can't make generalizations about other countries. But Bangladesh, I've studied a bit, I've written a book about it. So I think there is something at play which is worth emulating and watching very closely.
Fantastic. Now, Nancy, I wonder if we could talk a bit about the role of business, particularly investors. Now, you've done a lot of work looking at ESG. I'm wondering if you could very briefly explain ESG, but also we hear this about it all the time now. I mean, there are ESG officers, there are vice presidents in financial institutions that are focused on ESG. It's come to the point where a layman like myself will say, well, is this window dressing? Is this really happening? Is it taking off? Is it really serious? I know, we could do a whole program on this topic, but give you sort of a broad brush look at what are we talking about here?
Sure. Yeah, I'll move backwards. I've been working in the space in various ways for over 2 decades. So I've seen how quickly the pace of adoption of both the terminology and different types of initiatives at corporations and within investment companies, they've been adopted. I think broadly the intentions are good. Roughly about a third, the latest US SIF, which is the national organization in the US that kind of aggregates and does research and reports on the status of this, said that about a third of assets under management now have some kind of environmental, social, governance kind of screen or investment criteria.
Right.
So how diligent and how, I guess, precise and what the impact of that is varies very, very widely. So, some organizations are just, looking at ESG and looking at how does it materially impact their business. And so I think that's where there's a lot of opportunity for continued adoption, because ultimately the experience I think that we had with this study and talking to representatives of different brands who, by and large, the people that we spoke with were very passionate and wanting to do the right thing, but corporations ultimately have kind of one metric that they identify their success by, right? And that's their profit. And so if ESG and the materiality of ESG can be translated, because there's so many different factors, human factors, carbon and pricing, those becoming more translated into accounting metrics that can be standardized. And the SEC has a big initiative right now to create some kinds of standards and guidelines around ESG reporting, similar to what the EU is in the process of putting out and mandating. That's going to continue to drive it forward. So I think I personally believe it's something that will kind of encourage corporations to be more responsible and try and track these metrics and report on them. So I think it's moving in the right direction for sure.
Is the growth of ESG awareness of it, at least, and if not the necessity, but the awareness that you need to, display that you're doing some work on ESG, is that putting pressure on governments as well to address a lot of these issues? Because they feel that, if they want to attract investment and continue to attract more investment, that they need to be involved in a number of these issues.
I haven't thought about how governments are approaching it, outside of the fact that I think they understand that their financial institutions and the corporations will benefit from having standards around it. Right. So I think that there's that acknowledgement that they should be kind of leading that, because it's largely been led by, I would say, investors that have expressed an interest in, CalPERS, being here in California and being one of the largest.
That's pension fund in California.
A teacher's pension fund in California, yeah. 15, 16 years ago, they came out with a mandate for environmentally responsible portfolios. And therefore, every asset manager that wants to manage money for CalPERS is going to kind of figure out a way to fill that mandate and kind of win that account. And so I think a lot of the earlier growth was because of larger investors, universities, endowments, foundations that said, we want this. And then investors started doing it, and there haven't been standards around how those investors do that. So I think that's now where the SEC and, for example, again, the EU are saying, oh, we need to kind of make sure that this is done in a way that, we want to lead with it versus following. So.
Right.
Yeah,
No,
and just to build on that, I mean, Nancy's point that you have Norway and Sweden are two sovereign wealth funds, which are also very prominent. And they also have screens to screen out companies which fail certain criteria. So, they have moved out of coal producing companies. They've also moved out of companies which have allegations of human rights abuses. At one point, they were even considering leaving, large retailers which have labor supply issues in the US. And you could think Norway is a tiny country, but because of their oil wealth, they have huge investable surplus, and they're mandated by Norwegian government by an act of parliament to invest in specific manner. So they're not meant to chase the highest rate of return, but to rate of a return that is such that it will, ensure ethically procured income for the future generations of Norway. So I think those are interesting experiments. And I think a lot of other, how Norway has managed the oil wealth. Interestingly, Botswana wanted to learn from that, how to manage its the wealth it was getting from diamonds. It's cutting across, and it's also a very good example of, southern country trying to imitate something that we think is a luxury for northern economies.
Right. Now, Salil, this brings me, in fact, to John Ruggie, because the world lost John Ruggie as a pioneer in on a lot of these issues. Tell us a bit about him and your thoughts on his impact and what he achieved.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting.
Tell us a bit about who he is, because some of our readers
John Ruggie died on late last week in September, I'm aware that this will be seen at any time, so I need to say that it was in the second week of September. John Ruggie was a professor at Harvard at the Kennedy School, and he had been the assistant secretary for planning at the Secretary General for planning at the United Nations when Kofi Annan was the Secretary General between 1997 and 2001. And something that, everybody today knows about Sustainable Development Goals, but they came from what were known as Millennium Development Goals. And those Millennium Development Goals were drafted. One of the key drafters was John Ruggie. Similarly, there were two other initiatives with which he was very closely involved. One was a UN Global Compact, which started with only 50 companies, and all were Northern and Western, European, American, and I think maybe there was a Japanese company, but otherwise it was a very industrial North type of a setup. Today, there are 14,000 companies which are part of it. And that Global Compact includes adherence by companies to respect human rights, not to be complicit in human rights abuses. There are 4 principles for labor rights, 3 for environment, and 1 against corruption. Now, you could say that this is a very low-hanging fruit because companies only have to declare something. But even the declaration is a very hard thing for people to do, because once you declare something, other people want to hold you to account. And he took that to a completely different plane with the UN guiding principles for business and human rights. And these guiding principles were essentially a 3-pronged framework that he reminded the state and the company about what was there, that the state has a responsibility, a legal obligation to protect human rights. But companies have a responsibility to respect rights, and when there's a gap, you need a remedy. Now, what does respect mean? That is where the whole thing becomes very interesting. Yes, it doesn't mean simply saying that, yes, we have a human rights policy, but then you have to make sure that you're implementing it, creating incentives within the organization to implement it. He recommended what should be done, such as, do a human rights impact assessment, identify the salient risks you pose, take steps to ensure that those risks are eliminated or mitigated. And then if it is not done, explain why, and and find out and know what's happening, and then show what's happening, and then they take corrective mechanisms. So when you try to unpack, basically is reinventing the way the corporation looks at society. That's what he tried to do. Now, you could say that, but what has been the change on the ground? And of course, there are still abuses going on. But the problem about human rights and measurement, and this goes to the heart of what Nancy was talking about, ESG, that human rights improvements are very hard to measure. You can measure that more children have started going to school, but does the credit go to the company that pays taxes, or the school that is educating children better, or the government which is actually spending on education? It's very hard to tell. So it's very hard to isolate specific human rights benefits and say that a company was responsible for it. That becomes one of the problems. And he said that, this is a societal issue, and therefore you need state duty to protect, corporate responsibility to respect, and have the remedy where it is necessary. And I think what has happened as a result is that now governments have started making national action plans on one hand, and companies have started taking their diligence seriously. European Union is now asking companies to do mandatory human rights due diligence. France has a vigilance law, which is basically looking at how vigilant you are about your performance. And in other countries where there is a conflict situation, like let's say, Syria and Afghanistan and so on, the UN has come up with a new framework which looks at heightened due diligence, that you're supposed to be, and if you exit, how do you do it? So all these are still at a very early stage, but when taken together, and if we try to project what it might look like, if they're adhered well, and most important, if there's good enforcement around it, then we will see a better tomorrow. And I think the genius of John Ruggie was not to do what other special rapporteurs at UN do, which is write a denouncing report that human rights situation in Myanmar is terrible, or in China is terrible, or in India it's terrible. Yes, that is necessary. But he came up with practical ways of showing a roadmap that here's how you try to get it right. Now, it's like a highway code, as we used to call it in Britain, that it tells you how to drive a car and it tells you what the rules are. You can still have accidents, and that is where the enforcement comes in. So the next step is indeed in trying to make sure that it happens. And that was not his mandate, so he didn't go that far, but he at least put us on that path.
Great, thank you. Sanchita, I know we're coming to the end of this discussion, but the SDGs, as Salil has brought up, first the MDGs and then SDGs. How is Bangladesh doing in your view? And I don't know whether this is something you're following closely, but in terms of achieving the SDG targets, and that's an agenda for 2030. So we're really less than a decade left.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that in certain areas they've done extremely well. So for example, maternal health and early childhood, primary education, some of those categories. But in the areas that, for example, climate change, that is a huge sort of big area for Bangladesh going forward. I think it's certainly mixed on the goals, and they've done well on certain ones, but there's several that they need to pursue and need to follow on.
And just to build on that, Al, one of the interesting things about Bangladesh is that if you compare it within the region, then probably except Sri Lanka, if you look at South Asia's large countries, so it's India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. So Sri Lanka does beat Bangladesh on some social indicators, but Bangladesh is doing better than India and Pakistan on many social indicators. And as you refer to that basket case analogy at the time of its independence, and that has been completely turned on its head. I mean, Bangladesh has far superior indicators. In fact, the joke is that, for a long time, various Indian governments have said that we need a fence between India and Bangladesh to prevent infiltration of Bangladeshis who come into in India to take away jobs. It is classic right-wing rhetoric that a lot of Indians have said. And now my friends in Dhaka are joking, yes, we do need the wall there, because otherwise Indians will start coming to Bangladesh for work.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, I think in the areas of health and education were the two areas where it's done really well. Again, I would give the credit to the NGOs and the civil society for
Absolutely.
that, especially BRAC.
I think that's a very interesting point, because many people, outsiders, I think, or people perhaps unfamiliar with development work, often dismiss or overlook what civil society can do and has done, in many ways, fill in huge gaps that are left by that the governments are not filling, and that's really an important point. Now, I know you guys have been so generous with your time, but I'm going to stretch it a little bit by just asking you what I've been asking all our guests about how they've been doing during the pandemic, and maybe Sanchita, how are things where you are? Everything kind of back to normal at Berkeley? What has life been, and how have you been coping?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say, I definitely have a lot of privilege to be able to say that, well, my biggest problem was I had to just stay at home and, work from home and I was bored. That was mainly, a huge amount of privilege to be able to say that. Absolutely. I think initially when it started, it was just like everyone, it was so difficult to kind of get our head around. I personally felt, I love going to work. I mean, I work on a college campus, so it's very hard to do that remotely. I taught class remote last year. It went okay, but I really miss the students. As I mentioned about doing research remotely, normally I would travel to South Asia, couldn't do that. So we found alternative ways. I found alternative ways to do the work. I can't say that I was really, super happy about it. I'm much happier now. I really realized, the pandemic made me realize I really like people and I like actually meeting them, not just on Zoom. I'm a pretty outgoing person. So I'm back to teaching. I teach 2 classes at Haas and the students are great and everyone follows protocol and we're all masked, but I think students are just eager to be back and they enjoy that interaction and I'm enjoying that. Just on a practical level, I mean, I think it's been hard when we have a lot of family in India, and so the last several months have been difficult with what's happening in India. So US has been mixed. I think California overall has been doing fairly well. I think just today there was a report that California is actually one of the best states in terms of dealing with COVID and the latest wave. But I think South Asia is definitely mixed. And, when you have family abroad, that has been worrying and upsetting. Right. We've had a lot of personal losses, actually, from family and friends. So that's been a tough time.
Salil, how have you been doing? You're the globe trotter, but you've not been trotting the globe so much these days, although I know you're traveling again. So how have you been coping?
No, so my carbon footprint has gone down, which is probably good for the climate. I mean, I used to be away 7 to 10 days in a month usually, but that has gone down significantly. I live in Brooklyn and I'm lucky to get into Manhattan from here. I mean, it's sometimes it's that bad, but I've traveled a little bit, but I've increasingly traveled more for pleasure rather than work, meeting friends and family. That's what I've done a little bit of. I've always worked on my own from home, even the institute, even in pre-COVID times, we did not have a formal office. Even when I lived in London, we did not have an office to go to every day. So the idea of working by, Zoom, at Skype or whatever you call it, is not that alien. But what I do miss is making new contacts. It's great to strengthen bonds with people I already know, and because there's a level of trust and there's a level of familiarity in the conversation. But the kind of work, and all of us do, we are researchers, we are writers, we are journalists, we are academics. We do need to meet people we have never met before. And the face-to-face contact does make it easier for the other person to trust you, to share information. Sometimes you need 3 and 4 conversations, and it's almost impossible to do that, frankly, in a Zoom type setting, because people are extremely reluctant. I mean, you're recording a conversation and people wonder what it would be used for, whereas it's much easier face-to-face. I do miss that, and I do hope we can return to some form of regular life once again. Yeah.
And Nancy, how has your experience been?
Yeah, it's been mixed. I would say, had you asked me at the start of COVID, I was definitely, less than thrilled about finishing out the MDP program at Berkeley remotely, just because our class was so strong. Our cohort, we were from all over the world. I'm from the United States, but a majority of the students were international. So finish the program internationally, and I'm hoping that there'll be an opportunity to reconnect with those people that I didn't get to see when school went from in-person to remote overnight. So I feel for the people that have kind of missed those experiences, whether it's graduation or weddings or other moments that kind of really are markers. However, I used to travel quite a bit before for work. And I'm kind of enjoying the remote aspect of it. Just this morning, I was on a conference call for the Values Reporting Foundation, which is SASB and IIRC, the International Integrated reporting coalition have kind of merged. And so I was able to hear from people and kind of engage in a remote setting as to where I think before people thought that everything needed to be in person. So I feel like there are a lot more conferences and events that are maybe doing dual in person and having remote access. And that's, you know, both from like a personal perspective, not being on the road all the time is kind of nice, and being able to, you know, meet people that are on the other side of the world, even though it's not in person. I think having that option and having that balance, I'm appreciating. So making the most of it, but also looking forward to getting out there again.
Fantastic.
Mm.
You know, you guys have been so generous with your time. I really appreciate it. I commend our listeners, viewers to not only to the Asia Global Online article of a few weeks ago by Nancy, Salil, and Sanchita. Please go look at it, but also to the report that they have, and you can find a link to it in their AGO article. So I get you to go to AGO and then you can go check out the report. Thank you guys very much. I commend also to our listeners and viewers, I commend the Asia Global Online website. Please come and sign up for our newsletter. Go check out the Asia Global Institute website and follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube. You guys know the drill. So thank you so much. And Nancy, Salil, Sanchita, thank you so much for your time. And I know it's already late, very late in New York. And I've taken up the evening in California, but thank you so much. And hope we can do this again sometime.
Thank you,
Very
Al. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Al. Yeah.
Great.
Thanks very
Bye.
much. Bye-bye.